with tears streaming down my cheeks. I told him all that had happened, and he listened to me with a face set hard and grim. "For your father's sake," he said at last, "I will go with you, though I can do nothing." We went out together. The streets were dark and silent, and heavy with heat and a drought of many weeks. I saw the doctor's face white under the gas lamps. When we reached the house, his hand was shaking. We did not hesitate. We went upstairs directly. I held the lamp, and he called out in a loud, determined voice, "Mr. Lester, do you hear me? I insist on seeing you. Answer me at once." There was no answer, but we both heard that choking noise I have mentioned. "Mr. Lester, I am waiting for you. Open the door this instant, or I shall break it down." And he called a third time in a voice that rang and echoed from the halls. "Mr. Lester, for the last time I order you to open the door." "Ah," he said, after a pause of heavy silence. "We're wasting time here. Would you be so good as to get me a poker or something of that kind?" I ran into a little room at the back, where odd articles are kept, and found a heavy adze-like tool, and I thought something might serve the doctor's purposes. "Very good," he said. "That will do, I dare say. I give you notice, Mr. Lester," he cried loud at the keyhole. "I'm about to break into your room." And I heard the wrench of the adze, and the woodwork split and cracked under it. With a loud crash, the door suddenly burst open, and for a moment we started back aghast at a fearful screaming cry, no human voice, but as the roar of a monster that burst forth inarticulate and struck at us out of the darkness. "Hold the lamp," said the doctor, who went in and glanced quickly round the room. "There it is," said Dr. Barden, drawing a quick breath. "Look, in the corner." I looked, and a pang of horror seized my heart, as with a white-hot iron. There upon the floor was a dark and putrid mass, seething with corruption and hideous rottenness, neither liquid nor solid, but melting and changing before our eyes, and bubbling with unctuous, oily bubbles like boiling pitch. And out of the midst of it shone two burning points like eyes, and I saw a writhing and stirring of the limbs, and something moved and lifted up what might have been an arm. The doctor took a step forward, raised the iron bar, and struck at the burning points. He drove in the weapon and struck again and again in the fury of loathing. A week or two later, when I had recovered to some extent from the terrible shock, Dr. Barden came to see me. "I have sold my practice," he began, "and tomorrow I am sailing on a long voyage. I do not know whether I shall ever return to England. In all probability, I shall buy a little land in California, and settle there for the remainder of my life. I have brought you this packet, which you may open and read when you feel able to do so. It contains the report of Dr. Chambers on what I submitted to him. Goodbye, Mr. Lester, goodbye." When he was gone, I opened the envelope. I could not wait, and proceeded to read the papers within. Here is the manuscript, and if you will allow me, I will read you the astounding story it contains. "My dear Barden," the letter began, "I have delayed inexcusably in answering your questions as to the white substance you sent me. To tell you the truth, I have hesitated for some time as to what course I should adopt, for there is bigotry and orthodox standard in physical science as there is in theology, and I knew that if I told you the truth, I should offend rooted prejudices, which I once held dear myself. However, I have determined to be plain with you, and first I must enter into a short personal explanation. You have known me, Barden, for many years as a scientific man. You and I have often talked of our profession together, and discussed the hopeless gulf that opens before the feet of those who think to attain to truth by any means whatsoever, except the beaten way of experiment and observation in the sphere of material things. I remember the scorn with which you have spoken to me of men of science who have dabbled a little in the unseen, and have timidly hinted that perhaps the senses are not, after all, the eternal, impenetrable bounds of all knowledge, the everlasting walls beyond which no human being has ever passed. We have laughed together heartily, and I think justly, at the occult follies of the day, disguised under various names, mesmerisms, spiritualisms, materializations, theosophies, all the rabble-rout of imposture, with their machinery of poor tricks and feeble conjuring, the true back parlour of shabby London streets. Yet in spite of what I have said, I must confess to you that I am no materialist, taking the word of course in its usual signification. It is now many years since I have convinced myself, convinced myself, a skeptic, remember, that the old iron-bound theory is utterly and entirely false. Perhaps this confession will not wound you so sharply as it would have done 20 years ago, for I think you cannot have failed to notice that for some time hypotheses have been advanced by men of pure science which are nothing less than transcendental, and I suspect that most modern chemists and biologists of repute would have taken to subscribe the dictum of the old schoolman, omnia exiunt in mysterium, which means, I take it, that every branch of human knowledge, if traced up to its source and final principles, vanishes into mystery. I need not trouble you now with a detailed account of the painful steps which led me to my conclusions. A few simple experiments suggested a doubt as to my then standpoint, and a train of thought that rose from circumstances comparatively trifling brought me far. My conception of the universe has been swept away, and I stand in a world that seems strange and awful to me, as the endless waves of the ocean, seen for the first time, shining from a peak in Darien. Now I know that the walls of the senses that seem so impenetrable, that seem to loom up above the heavens, and to be founded below the depths, and to shut us in evermore, are no such everlasting impassable barriers as we fancied, but thinnest and most airy veils way before the seeker, and dissolve as the early mist of the morning about the brooks. I know that you never adopted the extreme materialistic position. You did not go about trying to prove a universal negative, for your logical sense withheld you from that crowning absurdity. But I am sure that you will find all that I am saying strange and repellent to your habits of thought. Yet, Herbarden, what I tell you is the truth, nay, to adopt our common language, the sole and scientific truth, verified by experience, and the universe is verily more splendid and more awful than we used to dream. The whole universe, my friend, is a tremendous sacrament, a mystic, ineffable force and energy, veiled by an outward form of matter and man, and the sun and the other stars, and the flower of the grass, and the crystal in the test tube, are each and every one as spiritual, as material, as the subject to our inner working. You will perhaps wonder, Herbarden, whence all this tends, but I think a little thought will make it clear. You will understand that from a standpoint the whole view of things is changed, and what we thought incredible and absurd may be possible enough. In short, we must look at legend and belief with other eyes, and be prepared to accept tales that had become mere fables. Indeed, this is no such great demand. After all, modern science will concede as much, in a hypocritical manner. You must not, it is true, believe in witchcraft, but you may credit hypnotism. Ghosts are out of date, but there is a good deal to be said for the theory of telepathy. Give superstition a Greek name, and believe in it should almost be a proverb. So much for my personal explanation. You sent me, Herbarden, a phial, stoppered and sealed, containing a small quantity of flaky white powder, obtained from a chemist who had been dispensing it to one of your patients. I am not surprised to hear that this powder refused to yield any results to your analysis. It is a substance which was known to a few many hundred years ago, but which I never expected to have submitted to me from the shop of a modern apothecary. There seems no reason to doubt the truth of the man's tale. He no doubt got, as he says, the rather uncommon salt you prescribed from the wholesale chemists, and this has probably remained on his shelf for 20 years, or perhaps longer. Here what we call chance and coincidence begin to work. During all these years the salt in the bottle was exposed to certain recurring variations of temperature, variations probably ranging from 40 to 80 degrees. And as it happens, such changes recurring year after year at irregular intervals, the variant duration have constituted a process, and a process so complicated and so delicate that I question whether modern scientific apparatus, directed with the utmost precision, could produce the same result. The white powder you sent me is something very different from the drug you prescribed. This is the powder from which the wine of the Sabbath, the vinum sabbati, was prepared. No doubt you have read of the witches' Sabbath, and have laughed at the tales which terrified our ancestors, the black cats, the broomsticks, and dooms pronounced against some old woman's cow. Since I have known the truth, I have often reflected that it is on the whole a happy thing that such burlesque as this is believed, for it serves to conceal much that is better, should not be known generally. However, if you care to read the appendix to Payne Knight's monograph, you will find the true Sabbath was something very different, though the writer has very nicely refrained from printing all he knew. The secrets of the true Sabbath were the secrets of remote times, surviving into the Middle Ages, secrets of an evil science which existed long before Aryan man entered Europe. Men and women, seduced from their homes on specious pretensions, were met by being well qualified to assume, as they did assume, the part of devils, and taken by their guides to some desolate and lonely place, known to the initiate by long tradition, and unknown to all else. Perhaps it was a cave in some bare wind-swept hill, perhaps some inmost recess of a great forest, and there the Sabbath was held. There, in the blackest hour of night, the vinum sabbati was prepared, and this evil gruel was poured forth, and offered to the neophytes, and they partook of the infernal sacrament, sumentes calcium principis inferorum, as the old author well expresses it. And suddenly each one that had drunk found himself attended by a companion, a share of glamour, and unearthly allurement, beckoning him apart, to share in joys more exquisite, more piercing than the thrill of any dream, to the consummation of the marriage of the Sabbath. It is hard to write such things as these, chiefly because that shape that allured with loveliness was no hallucination, but awful as it is to express the man himself. By the power of that Sabbath wine, a few grains of white powder thrown into a glass of water, the house of life was riven asunder, and the human trinity dissolved, and the worm which never dies, that which lies sleeping within us all, was made tangible and an external thing, and clothed with a garment of flesh. And then in the hour of midnight the primal fall was repeated and represented, and the awful thing veiled in the mythos of the tree in the garden was done anew. Such was the nuptio sabbati. I prefer to say no more. You, Habarden, know as well as I do that the most trivial laws of life are not to be broken with impunity, and for so terrible an act as this, in which the very inmost place of the temple was broken open and defiled, a terrible vengeance followed. What began with corruption also ends with corruption. Underneath, in the following, in Dr. Habarden's writing, the whole of the above is unfortunately strictly and entirely true. Your brother confessed all to me on the morning when I saw him in his room. My attention was first attracted to the bandaged hand, and I forced him to show me. What I saw made me, a medical man of many years' standing, grow sick with loathing, and the story I was forced to listen to was infinitely more frightful than I could have believed possible. It has tempted me to doubt the internal goodness which can permit nature to offer such hideous possibilities, and if you had not with your own eyes seen the end, I should have said to you, disbelieve it all. I have not, I think, many more weeks to live, but you are young, you may forget all this. Joseph Habarden, M.D. In the course of 2 or 3 months, I heard that Dr. Habarden had died at sea shortly after the ship left England. That was The Novel of the White Powder by Arthur Machen, read by Dom Newton, produced for radio by Preacher Productions.